for inviting me to this afternoon's presentation. I work for Orange, or better for Orange Business Services, a subsidiary of Orange. Orange is the ex-France Telecom, now since 20 years called Orange, with about 150,000 people working for it globally. And amongst them are the 25,000 working for Orange Business Services. And in Orange Business Services, there is a global network, a global backbone network operated for large enterprise customers, but also for administrations, for instance. And in doing so, what this company offers is basically network access, corporate connectivity, internet connectivity, cloud services, and similar. And so I think what you're all trained on a daily basis at university will at some stage also bring some of you to this domain of telecommunications eventually and feed into the larger manpower of companies like Orange Business Services. I'm going to come back to that later and just basically wanted to introduce also why I'm speaking today on this topic that you have been introduced to see, so interdisciplinary work in an international environment. So during all my career so far, I've been working in an international environment. I've started at the university, as many of us, then went on to working in public administration at the regulatory authority in Austria. Then I worked for Siemens and Nokia, spent quite a number of years in Brussels being a corporate lobbyist, and have worked on very many different topics so far, also then within Orange Business Services, coming, let's say, in touch with lots of different aspects of this wide IT, ICT connected world. Why I think it's interesting to speak about working across different fields and interdisciplinary between different people, not only in a corporate environment, but also probably already at university, is that when I think back, and I've been trained as a lawyer, I've been working many years, of course, amongst a purely legal environment, talking each day with other lawyers, with other students that studied law. And of course, you then develop yourself in a certain bubble, and you think that everybody else is also in this bubble and speaks the same language. And you feel pretty comfortable with what you do. You write your papers for university courses, you write your theses, and all that in your specific language that you think is completely understandable to everybody else. And I think you, training in a technical environment, you do pretty much the same thing. So you also work in your respective bubble, you learn about the latest and greatest in technology, you have your abbreviations at hand that you use day in and day out. And you throw in a diagram here and there eventually when you explain your things, and also think this is the only way of thinking and this is the only way of going forward when starting to work eventually outside the university environment. That this is the way that people will work together with you and understand what you mean. And so what I've come to see going along, and we can come to the next slide, I think, Dubravko, is that, and the next one, please. So when you come to these different mindsets and these different bubbles, and they are then thrown together to work on a project, so that can be already at university if you think that one faculty is asking to work together on maybe an EU project that is funded for different disciplines already there to work with another faculty, or later on, as I saw it in my work, that I'm, let's say, in a minority, one of the few lawyers in a big technological organization with maybe a few finance people, then a few sales people, of course, but mostly people with a technology background. And they speak their language, also then have their own corporate language with corporate abbreviations put onto that. And you come to that pretty much new, and you will probably experience the same thing when you first start working. And you think first, I have absolutely no idea what these people are all talking about and how come they seem to understand each other so well. And you stand there and think, well, up to a certain point in my life, I thought also I'm, well, trained in my profession. I speak a certain language, I can express my thoughts, but all of a sudden this all seems a bit blurred and different than before. And so you try to fit in and you try to make sense of this all. And it's basically no wonder when you think about it that you do not only have different professions, you also have different ways of thinking, of course, amongst people. We just heard before we started an interesting little debate amongst ourselves whether or not what is a monarchist or what would speak for monarchy or speak against monarchy. So of course everybody has its own way of thinking, of upbringing, of what he hears from, be it parents, be it teachers, be it professors, other peers. And so with this worldview, one is thrown into the working environment, then you add some co-workers with the same tradition, with the same different background that they are coming along and are being brought up. Then you have something which might be then subject to age difference or experiences, different cultures, different country backgrounds, different different experiences that people make. And then lately, also everybody experiencing this more and more remote sense of working. Also here we see we don't meet up at the university anymore. We don't see each other. We do not chat before or after over a coffee or so. And if you throw this all together, it is basically a sheer wonder that we can work together at all and that we understand something of each other at all. And so, having said that, what I find myself in often, and I think many people experience the same thing, but it's not often talked about, is that the first thing you do is, and we can come to the next slide, please, is trying to decipher what the other person is really saying. And so what I see often is basically that, I think we can click once more, Dubravko, basically a completely shaded, back once more, a completely shaded argument being thrown at somebody. So I can open, I don't know, at least a fraction of my emails these days, but lately more than before, I think, because people tend to be super busy and to try to get their work done. But let's say if I open an average email, I will read something, brief sentence, that can sound something like, can you come to the DRI call at 1400? It's about TRAAV and it's important. And you think, well, the only thing I understand is that somebody wants something from me and they want me to do something at 2 o'clock and it is a conference call eventually. I don't even have any other details. I don't know what customer they are talking about. I don't know what topic they are talking about and why I have been chosen to be invited. And if I look at the person sending it to me, it might be very well so that I've never heard from the person before. And then eventually the next step is that something like you see here on the left, and it's not important at all what the whole thing says, it is governed by a diagram. So as I said, so I get something out of the blue asking me to do something which I don't understand. And it's accompanied by a diagram that is supposed to tell me what this is all about. And so then, of course, you try to make sense of this, and you try to decipher what the person wants and why he wants it, and what this is all about, and what you can really do to help them. At the same time, if I may just take an example from my own environment, and that's shown on the right-hand side, and again, it's not important at all what the content of it is at all. It is something that would be completely normal for a lawyer to say, well, we've got a certain norm, we've got a certain law in place, and then there has been a first proposal how to amend it, and a second proposal how to amend it, and let's now work on how we want this to look like eventually, and what we can live with or what we cannot live with. And so this might be equally confusing if it is not explained. So I see a hand up, so Zlatan, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to ask a question. Since there's often a place for misunderstanding, and you're a pretty big company, do you have some kind of protocols to ease out the communication? So you come from different backgrounds, you come from different countries, and I know I would assume there's some protocol in which type of manner you should communicate with each other in company.
Right. Yeah. So it's a great question, and to a certain extent, yes. So for certain functions, it's easier to have something like a protocol or like a standardized way of interacting. So often there are sort of tools where you fill in a form and you specify what you want and why you want it, etc. So if you have an IT problem, or if you have a human resource related problem, that might be easier and can be standardized. And I mean, we try also to do something similar more and more for legal topics, but it's not as easy because obviously the biggest thing is really to explain what the question is and what the person's problem is at large. And so no matter how many lines you have in a form, it will never really go into the same level of detail that might be needed for a person to explain what he's after. But of course, a lot of things like that are happening. Also, chatbots and what have you are thought about. But of course, that works for certain simpler things, or also self-help portals with regularly asked questions and things like that. That helps to ease some of the tensions for certain basic problems. But more often than not, it's really as I said, different people coming together and trying to work together without being really governed by a bigger protocol or so. And the only thing what I try to make people see also is that, especially because we have so different backgrounds and because we speak these different dialects, if you like, it would be really great to move away as much as one can from his specific language, from his specific abbreviations and text speak. And you can never assume that another person understands even half as much as you do about your own specialty, about your own basic training that you've had. And so even if it sounds silly sometimes to really say, this abbreviation means this and this, and as you might have heard already, but I'm trying to explain, the product is about this and this, or the customer has bought this and this. So it really helps to really anticipate that the other person has never heard of this, doesn't know that you're since 2 years working on nothing else but then this, and benefits from a little explanation. So explaining is also an interesting aspect, I thought, when it comes to defining these challenges and problems that somebody has in his profession. So basically what I've also experienced often is those people who really understand their problem well, they can explain it in layman's terms very easily. And I'm always bringing the example of try to explain it to your own grandmother. And imagine the grandmother is very, very savvy, but is very short tempered and doesn't have a lot of time and wants to get to the baseline of facts very quickly. And this grandmother cannot be fooled easily and will definitely ask questions and try to find out what you say and have you explain any inconsistencies very quickly. And so if that can be the baseline understanding, to say I explain it so that everybody can understand it, that would really help things further.
Would you say that then that most of your communication is based on KISS principle? I mean, keep it simple, stupid, or
yes, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And the simpler, what I find often is that if you try to do things in writing, it might get misunderstood. If you do things verbally, it might get misunderstood too. So at a certain point, you need to draw the line and try to find common ground that everybody speaks about the same thing and understands the same thing. And that is not as easy as it sounds. And so really to come to a position before you then even talk about maybe writing that down in a legal text, which might be the necessary step at a later stage. But before you come to that, there is lots of discussion, of course, to say where does the person come from who might be a salesperson that talks to a customer? Where does a finance person come in and has certain questions to other professions? Where is, let's say, a support function demanding questions from other functions that have sold a certain item or have a question on how the history of things have led to a certain point in time. And so all that happens before things are really put down in legal language. And in working up to this stage, everybody benefits definitely from layman's terms and easy to understand language. Coming to the next slide, I think we also have a big fight for attention that is going on, and lots of information overload. And you will also have seen that already in your daily lives, but I think especially lately over the past couple of years, this has gotten worse, at least for me. You see endless email threads at the same time. You have instant messages going on. Then you have people meeting up like we do at the moment in video conferences, and all that is really trying to get people's attention and draw attention away from the things at hand that they need to work on. And then you have the constant problem of trying to find space for your day-to-day work to really sit down, concentrate on something, while at the same time you should be attentive and try to figure out what to do and how to interact on an ongoing basis, because the attention is needed there as well. And I think this is also a problem of modern times, of course, but might have been also happening in earlier years. So that differentiating between what is really at hand at the moment, what is there that you need to do your actual work, and what time can you spend on other things at the same time or at a specific time of the day, is a daily decision to take, and this is not easy. Just wanted to bring one example from, let's say, the recent, or not so recent past, but which came up recently again and reminded me of it. Fighting for attention in the Brussels environment, since we spoke about that earlier too. And when you think of the big parliament in Brussels, where you have 750 or so delegates from different countries that try to make their best to get into subject matters to decide on future texts of future laws, they of course are also definitely the center of attention and the center of a fight for attention from others. And so they have something like a big mailbox in the Parliament building in Brussels. And this is an open mailbox with something like pigeonholes where everybody, not only the local mail, can send letters to, but everybody can basically go there and put some piece of paper in these pigeonholes. And so, let's say, put into a picture in the sense, if you like, this is what is happening all the time to us too. So we have a certain attention span at hand. That might be our email, that might be our, I don't know, what you use in terms of social media threads, or the average chatbot or whatever is there. So this is sort of figuratively speaking the pigeonhole where other people send in their position papers, their statements, what they think is important to them. And then it's really up to the politicians there and to us in our daily work as well to differentiate and to find what is really worth our attention and what needs to be dealt when. And coming to the next slide, I think that brings us to the topic of how to prioritize and how to live also with sort of mixed messages that are coming our way often. And so often I think when it comes to prioritization, there is a big myth out there that says, well, definitely you touch one piece of information once and then it's done with and over with and you can file it somewhere and it's over. And I often find this is not the case. So if you have found that this is something super important and super urgent and you need to prioritize and focus on a specific topic, you will often touch it more than once and cannot easily file it away. And this is not something that is going really one step at a time, and you receive a message, you work on the message, you file the message, and that's that. Also, at the same time, keeping above ground and keeping an overview about all the things that demand your attention and that demand to get prioritized in the day-to-day work is not easy. And this is also, again, bringing us back to maybe intercultural items, where often it is so that those people who shout the loudest get served first. And then depending on where this person is coming from, it might be offensive not to get back to the person, or it might be considered impolite by the person to ask a second time when he's asked already once. And so this is very difficult to find out at the exactly right moment how different people treat their urgencies themselves and how they expect you to treat these urgencies. And so there will always be room for interpretation to say, am I confronted with a person that is extremely direct and also has a cultural background of being direct to the point without any friction, or am I dealing with somebody who needs to beat around the bush a little bit because of his cultural background that might say, never say something direct, never offend anybody, never make the other person lose face. And in confronting the other person with a simple statement like, but I've sent you something already last week, where is my answer? That would mean the other person loses face and can't be done. And so this is definitely something that needs study, I think, depending on in which environment you are in or you're going to be in. And it seems like soft skills that are not so important, but in fact, I've found very often that this is amongst the most important things to know who you're dealing with and what the person's expectations are, really. At the same time, often there are mixed messages, something along the lines like, you know what, it's not urgent, but the boss is very interested in it. So when it's about your own boss and you hear at the same time, well, we can keep it for later, but it's one of his most important topics at the time being, it's again a matter of trying to find out how to prioritize and where to put this in your schedule and in the tight attention span that you might have yourself at the moment. What I also find in terms of mixed messages and also very much a soft skill issue again is people who want something solved but try to not confront yourself with a problem, and they try to solve it in a way to get their item off their table in a sort of a mean way, and trying to deviate from the actual issue and confuse you a little bit. And so that often happens, I think, as well, when all of a sudden you convene to meet for something, as let's say as a regular meeting might be conducted for a specific topic. You prepare for this meeting, you go to the meeting, you think it's about a specific topic, and all of a sudden the attention shifts to something totally different. And the deviation from this actual issue happens. Everybody also, or all of a sudden, speaks about something different, and you think, okay, yes, so we're discussing a different matter. But gradually this might lead to the fact that the actual issue that should have been decided in the meeting gets lost around the way, or is considered to be solved, which then leads to what is also often happening, a sort of a blame game, to say whose fault was it now, so that the deviation happened, that the situation hasn't been clarified, that the project has stalled or is not going forward. And so that is again often then a problem to say, well, who is it then who brings things back on track, and who tries to solve the issue at hand, who tries to bring people's attention back to the actual matter. So that is, I think, what we could call a question of when to speak up, when to remain silent. But often, as I said, I experienced it. This is something that might be happening for whatever reason, and that might bring you into trouble and can eventually lead to a problem that you did never see coming. And so,
can I ask you a question?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. You work in a big company, and I wonder, is there any I don't know job position people who manage that? I mean, whose only job is to lead the meetings. I'm not talking about a department manager or some, no, but the person who does that for every team, and they guide the meetings.
No, not really. So I mean, it might happen if there is a big conference where the CEO of the company speaks and is interviewed by somebody who then forms the discussion, leads the discussion in some shape or form. But this is not done on a day-to-day level. And of course, it would be great to have somebody like this. It would be great to have somebody who writes minutes and who notes that down. I think it depends on the department, depends on the actual setup of the team. But definitely there is lots of room for improvement on this front. And I saw that also with the work that I did in Brussels. So when you think of working in a big association, for instance, or in an industry body where different companies work together, there, of course, it is more formalized. There you also have competition law aspects where you say if you have an association and if competitors work together, this needs to happen in a guided environment. And with guided, I mean that exactly what you spoke about needs to happen, that somebody has an agenda that is shared beforehand and people follow the agenda. A person from the industry association writes down minutes and documents that, so that not everything that has been said is lost, but at the same time that everybody can prove that this has not been anti-competitive behavior, but really legitimate interest that has been brought to the table onto a specific meeting. But inside companies, I see it rather not happening, that things are going according to specific predefined contexts, although, as we said, this might be better in many instances. Right. Thinking about experts in big entities, in big companies. So that is one of the topics I think is the most important as well, to really find out in a company who does what and who is an expert on what is expected from yourself and what you can safely expect from others. And I think back to one university course I attended once was a philosophy training, and the professor was the university's professor on Plato, and he said, you know what, I would like to open the series of this semester with something where you might be shocked now as my students, but I've been studying Plato for all my university life, and I'm teaching now since 20 years. But I can safely tell you I'm by no means an expert on Plato's seventh letter. And this was so interesting in the sense that you think to yourself in the corporate environment, things work very differently. So if you come from university or even later on and you show an interest in something, or you work on a specific item for a little period of time, and people think that you've now gained a certain level of expertise in this specific subject matter, you very quickly become the subject matter expert in this subject. And then you think to yourself, well, it's not 20 years that I'm in this subject, and it's not something that I've been studying deeply, and here I'm the expert. Whereas in another environment, I would never in the world call myself an expert. And having said that, so this is always interesting to see when you dig around for information, when you need to solve a problem in a bigger corporation. Where do you find this information? Where do you find these experts? And again, here, when you talk to other professions, they for sure know their topics inside out. They might be able to communicate it to you clearly, as we said at the beginning of the lecture. But still, you need to put that together at some point in time and rely on these experts, and also rely on the fact that you understood and you are able to formalize then a common approach to solving the problem. That might be, for instance, you have a complicated customer project and you need input from finance teams, from sales teams, from pre-sales teams, from product teams that describe what the latest news on the product level are, etc. And then really gradually come to a position that can be put down on some slides, then to be presented to a customer or to an analyst or other people. And so this is one of the most important things, especially when you're new somewhere, to find who is the expert on a specific topic, who you can rely on, who you can go to, who you would approach to get an explanation in a specific field. Same on the next slide, I think, is then the big problem or the big challenges, modern day problems are called, of requesting input and of having maybe wrong expectations also about what others can give you. And also here, I'm just thinking of an example I had very early on in my time at Orange. So all of a sudden I got an email, I think it was, where somebody said, well, we cannot find Peter. And I thought, okay, again, why is it coming to me? Who's Peter and who's asking? And then the chain of emails built up and lots of people were responding, and it turned out a whole storyline around, this Peter is missing since a couple of hours and nobody can get in touch with him. And it turned out he's working somewhere remotely in a different country. He turned out to be a field service engineer who was sent to a specific customer site to install something. And the story built up like a rumor would build up, really. And the rumor basically said, well, since we haven't been able to talk to him for such a long while, you never know what happened. Maybe he has been taken hostage. The other one said, no, he's probably already in jail. Then the story developed on what he could have possibly done wrong to go to jail. Then all of a sudden it came in, well, Margit is on this whole email chain as well. She can for sure get him out of jail then, and we may want to send her there and have her intervene there on Peter's behalf. And so I was really trying to find out what is happening and why is it happening, and again coming to terms with this and managing also this expectation that having never heard of this colleague, I can help him with whatever his problem might be. Fortunately, it turned out that he was by no means taken hostage. He was not put into jail, and it was just so that he was out of an area where he had mobile connectivity, and so nobody could reach him on his phone. And he safely came home in the evening and could report back that he installed whatever he had to install. But basically, just as an example about this sometimes unrealistic expectation that people can do something about something, which is not clearly there, is not defined, is not eventually a problem at all. And things build up, and then information overload happens to everyone involved, and stories develop that are not really happening. And so often, of course, those misunderstandings are also helping us to get to the bottom of things. But more often than not, it really turns down to the same topic that we've already spoken about, that it is really about finding out what is at hand, what is the problem, requesting the right person, the right expert to help, and to solve a matter then in peace and quiet rather than in hectic information overload like campaigns, or just simply swamping somebody with information that might not be relevant. The same thing is also happening the other way around. I think what is often called nowadays in dating portals or so ghosting, so that somebody is just disappearing from the scene and never to be heard of anymore. To a certain extent, that might also happen in the corporate environment, that a person says, don't call us, we call you, and you never hear from them anymore, which is also, of course, not ideal, and which can be mitigated in an environment where there is a certain hierarchy, of course, easier than in a private environment. Which brings us, I think, to the next point, which is who is the decision maker and what can you do if this is happening to you, that somebody who you urgently need information from is nowhere to be found. So having found out who the expert is who can help you and who might not be in touch anymore or cannot be gotten hold of anymore, this is then a matter to bring eventually to the attention of the decision maker, or to discuss with somebody first, of course, before you bring it to the attention of the decision maker. But for that, you need to know who it is and who this person works with, what his risk appetite is also, and what the person can or cannot do for you and the concrete problem at hand. So anything that you've done in your interdisciplinary piece of work already with the various experts that you work together with the information that you've put together for a project or a report or a paper or something, at a certain point needs to go to a decision maker. And so this can be, if you're in academic environments, this can be, of course, a publication that needs to be done, and then you need to approach a decision maker whether or not your paper is going to be published. It might be a professor for a project that you work with a professor with, or in a corporate environment, a specific department head, or head of a business unit, whatever it is. In the lobbying environment, it might be a certain party that writes a report in a lawmaking process, or a specific politician who can table amendments or anything of that nature at a certain stage. So definitely finding out who the decision maker is and how he thinks and what he wants and expects is important. And at the same time, of course, it is important to know what kind of risk is this person going to take easily and what he isn't. And depending on this risk appetite, you will have to prepare more or less in terms of responding to this risk appetite. So coming to the next slide, I think the picture here shows you best what it means to speak about risks and to configure risks into your project, your paper or so. So depending on the person who might be very risk adverse, this will be a big exercise, and you will have to predict how likely it is that a certain impact is going to hit, and what it would mean to you as a student, for you as a project lead, for you in a corporate environment with a customer project, and qualify and quantify this risk for the decision maker so that he can guide you towards the decision more easily. At the same time, and with that on the next slide, I think it's also important to think about feedback. And I've seen, I think, courtesy of the Scott Adams Foundation here with the Dilbert comic here, that of course feedback is something that is important to all of us, not only to the decision maker, but also to you who work in a project team, in an interdisciplinary team, to give each other feedback and to see also what to make of it. And it's always the fine line of being between honesty and politeness, of course, but at the same time also, again, coming back to the earlier point of cultural differences, and to really say what you mean, but word it so that the person is getting it in a form that he expects it, so without losing face, without being personally offended, because of course you will have to work with these people for longer, and therefore also find out how the best possible feedback line is going back to them in return. I think a word on lobbying, since this was a very long period for me in my professional career, and what it means and what it can tell you also in your current stage of your professional development and your future career. So the lobbying that we often speak about when we talk amongst ourselves about what is happening, and you might think of the COVID crisis as the best possible example. Of course, lobbying is often seen as something that is happening behind closed doors, people doing something really shady, that trying to influence others, trying to meet them over coffee or over a drink somewhere, and to do something that is maybe not according to the book. But in fact, I think lobbying is a much wider field and a much more interesting field than this general conception in the public, I think, because basically it means how do you defend your interests, and how do you bring your interests on the table that might otherwise be forgotten. And so whether you do that as a professional lobbyist towards lawmakers in a specific country, or in Washington, or in the African Union, or in Brussels, doesn't really matter. So it's something that also holds true for your own interests if you're, let's say, holding a bigger meeting at the faculty, or if you're up for a specific thing that you want to bring to the local mayor. In a sense, whenever you're not a politician yourself, or somebody who is in the inner decision-making circle of an entity, anything you want to bring to these people's attention might be considered lobbying. And so when it is about bringing your interest to the attention of others, as we said earlier, it's again, of course, something that needs to take into consideration that the other people's attention span is probably very short, or that their level of expertise and their field of expertise is completely different than what your field of expertise or your particular issue is all about. And so obviously you will need to first and foremost think about a strategy how to bring this interest in an easy to understand manner, and how you then bring this topic of interest to the attention of another person who you think is a decision maker or has access to a decision maker, and can help you there to bring this subject matter to the attention of this person. So in doing so, what is requested of you is also often to sort through of a lot of information, and also familiarize yourself with a difficult topic in a very short time frame. That is something you would need to do, and what you train for anyway in your university life as well. I think no matter what your concrete subject is that you study, this is one of the basic things you learn at the university, that there is lots of information out there, people have worked on a specific item for years. They have produced papers. There are books out there. There are databases to consult. There are arguments for and against certain theories, and other theories have been on the market for the longest time and might not be longer valid, but still merit to be mentioned. And so what you do in your day-to-day student life is also filter a lot of information, condense it, make it concise, understandable, so that you can memorize it, can write it down for your thesis, or bring forward in an exam or similar. And so similar to that is the work of a lobbyist. You come to a certain point where you want to defend your interest. You need to take into consideration anything that has happened in this field already. Arguments that have been brought against your interest eventually in the past, arguments that have been brought against this. You need to collect this, you need to sort it, you need to condense it, bring it to a paper eventually, or a presentation, or something that you can talk about in what might be an elevator pitch, so something very short that you can bring to a person if you meet him briefly for a 20-second ride together in an elevator, or something along this kind. And so this is one of the personality traits you need to have to be interested in a subject, get to grips quickly. You need to be able to argue the pros and the cons of this specific item. And then, of course, you need to like to talk to different sorts of people to really get this message across. Again, if you found the people that you need in terms of experts to help you to build up your argumentation, you found the people that are the decision makers, you've already done quite a bit. And then you need to find a way to find access to these people. And eventually, if that is not so easy, or if there is not one decision maker but many, so think of a parliamentary committee that consists of, 20 people, or you think of a whole party that is against something, and you might want to convince him that this is not a good idea. You will have to talk to many people, to several or many people, to really bring your point across repeatedly, and to be seen, to be visible with this specific item that you're after. Often it is important to form allies and to work together with others. And again, here it depends on the subject that you want to talk about, of course. But amongst these allies, of course, also there are different interests, and to really form an ally, to go across a subject matter, to find a compromise that you want to then bring forward to a decision maker, is something that requires all sorts of skills. Basically, what we said earlier, you need to bring your point across, you need to find another person who is willing to listen to it, to bring in experts, to find time to argue this in a concise manner so that everybody, including the important grandmother, understands it, and then go out and talk to these people. So this, of course, also requires you to be visible. You need to have access to the decision makers, be that so that you meet them in specific hearings, or you have certain associations that host meetings for a specific topic, and you're present there, you're able to present, or you have eventually the means and the budget, depending whether you're an NGO or a corporate lobbyist. Of course, that can differ, that you host a meeting yourself on a specific topic and bring the attention of your audience towards this topic through inviting them to a specific talk. So there are various ways of bringing people together. Recently, of course, also via webinars or meeting online, which makes things a bit more democratic and easier to a certain extent. But in whatever shape or form, you need to find the people that are important, and you need to get to them in whatever shape and form, and often repeatedly. What I've found in trying to argue for certain subjects in the past, and those were mainly in the arena of fixed and mobile telephony and networks, of course, in the past, as I said, having worked for Siemens and for Nokia. What I found is that even if you have good grounds for going into a certain direction and trying to make people see that it pays off to work through the weeds of technology as well and to understand certain aspects, you will always have somebody in opposition who just wants to destroy whatever you bring forward. And so one of the baselines and one of the learnings, I think, for me often were never underestimate the level of destructiveness of others, and being against something is always so much easier than being for something. And so what we see, I think, also in today's world, and talking about the COVID crisis again and all the vaccines that come or do not come our way, I think exactly the same shows again. There is a huge demand of people, policymakers, politicians, to build up something, to build up a vaccination program, to bring things to the population, to give them the possibility to get vaccinated, for instance, etc. And nobody has ever done that in that rocket speed before. Nobody has ever been confronted with such a pandemic before. And of course, being against whatever is put on the table or what is tried out or what works somewhere and eventually doesn't work otherwise is easy. So being against is very easy, and destroying something is easy. So building something and being for something is much more complicated and takes up much more energy, both in terms of sort of lobbying for getting people interested in it, first and foremost, and then of following up on it and getting it through up to installing a certain program, a certain law, whatever it is that you're lobbying for. That takes time. The defamation and wrong accusation problem is also often a side effect of people who want to argue for something. So not only is it easy to get something off the table and destroy an argumentation completely, but often it's also so that people just want something different. They don't want it the way you want it. They want it differently. And in order to make your argumentation look worthless or worth definitely less than their argumentation, although they might see that it is a good way of arguing for something that you represent, they might start to wrongly accuse you of something. And to bring a recent example, so for instance, there is maybe a large market out there for equipment that is no longer used and that gets refurbished. It might be computers, might be smartphones, etc. And this secondary market is definitely happening. It's existing somewhere. And if you bring that as an example for something that might ease the tension of some entity not having enough budget to investing in something new, but they should eventually try and think of investing into a refurbished item. Others might easily put that off the table and say, no, this is a gray market, this is something shady, this has never occurred to us before, we don't want that. And so in bringing this counter-argumentation, in defaming you and wrongly accusing you of wanting something, let's say, half-witted or even illegal sometimes. Of course, they win time. They get into a sidetrack discussion that is pulling everybody into a direction that is not really bringing matters forward. But that, just as an illustration, happens very often. So that's why lobbying takes a long time and is often sidetracked, and you find yourself in sometimes very absurd discussions that might not lead to any point. But of course, you need to go through the motions and defend yourself so that you can come back to the starting point and to the original thing you were after. So also, last but not least, here in the lobbying terms, often you work also with people that have a completely different worldview again, like we said at the beginning, and who might consider, say, fake news as facts. And also there you need to really see where you can gain ground, where you can win people over without making them look stupid, without making them lose face, as we said earlier as well, but to still argue alongside the facts you have been given by experts that you have consulted early on, and try and put things into the right light that might work out in certain arenas and might not work out in others. So, for instance, what has happened often to me in the past is that people said, well, the base station is something that we see always necessary for a mobile network. Yes, of course, there is a tower somewhere that is necessary, but please don't put it anywhere near my backyard. Put it somewhere else, because obviously the radiation is not going to do me any good. And then they come up with all kinds of research that would eventually show that over a period of time, radiation has done this and that to either animals or people in the course of several years. Or people might even go as far as to say, well, the Wi-Fi router that they have at home is causing them headaches, etc. And then even if you come up with counter arguments with other studies or so, there will always be an argument along the sides of, but the long-term effect, we do not know. How long is this technology on the market? Is it 30 years? Is it 40 years eventually? But who knows what's happening after that? So all those things do happen. We're all people after all, and people, as we say, have different experiences, have different backgrounds, have different beliefs, different ways of looking at things. But overall, still to find common ground, to fight for something, to bring your interests to the attention of others, you need to somehow meet them halfway and try to argue as much as you can into the direction that you can without completely losing sight of the argumentation at hand and the issue at hand. But definitely it is something that is far more granular than what people traditionally think, that you say you meet somebody over coffee, you talk about a certain item and then that's sorted, and the really bad lobbyists that are out there are doing nothing good at all for us as people at large. So I think one needs to look at this in a much more fine-tuned level and say, well, as with anything in life, you need to look a bit and dig a bit deeper and to see what is this about, who is doing what are they arguing for, what are the lobbyists really after. There might be people who argue for a good cause. Of course, there might also be people who argue for something that is not all too beneficial. Finally, what I wanted to say also is a word on don't take it personally. So often this is something you will hear, whether you work in an academic environment or in a corporate environment or as a lobbyist, as we say. There are fights all over the place. You will end up in certain discussions that might be more or less personal, because of course wherever there are people that need to work together, and especially, as we said, across different backgrounds with different languages as first languages, with different cultural backgrounds, there will be an argument at some point in time. And then whenever there is an argument, at some point somebody will say, don't take it personally. But more often than not, what I find also is we're all people, we're all persons, and so it's really difficult to not take things personally. So it's as with anything also in your private environment, it's always important to really choose your battles well and to think first where it is worth to fight and where it isn't. Also, never underestimate the ill will of others. So that's also something that I often think to myself, I wish somebody had told me before I started working. So more often than not, you will encounter people that have their own agenda, that follow up on this agenda very diligently, and that will throw you under the bus at the first possible moment, because they think they can hide behind you, they can use your enthusiasm or your engagement in a certain manner for their own benefit. And so it is something that always needs to be, I think, in the back of your mind, to really think about what the other person's interest is, what the other person's personal agenda might look like, and in how far this is a trustworthy partner, a trustworthy person to work with. And also, last but not least, I think one of the most important things still to this date for me is to ask questions wherever things are not clear, even if others make you feel stupid because of it. And never stop exploring, never stop experiencing new things, and also asking other people if you don't know what they are after, what they are talking about, to really make things easier for you in your professional life and in your daily work as well. With that, I thank you for your time today, and of course we can use the rest of the time for any questions or discussion items you might want to bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Margit.
Thank you.
So I'll stop sharing the screen and return back. Okay, so here am I. Let me see the chat board. There is no questions there, just one picture. Is there any question from the audience, please?
I have one. Okay, you work in a big telecommunication company, and lobbying is, as you said, important in every part, and Croatia has a long history of needing that. So there's an example of AT&T Verizon being fined for bribing in lobbying. So would you say it affects the picture about lobbying on global scale? That people think that it's always about money.
Right. So I mean, this is an important factor, of course. So lobbying should not be equaling bribery, of course, rather the opposite. And what I see also happening, and what I've been also teaching internally in the company since many years now, is that more or less all global companies these days have anti-bribery programs and whistleblowing tools and all things like that. And so there is a big need to interpret local laws that are there against bribery. And especially in a big multinational company like the one I'm working for, the interesting thing is to say you need to look at not only one country's anti-bribery laws, but you need to also take into consideration other countries where you operate and which legislation applies to you too. So, for instance, if your stocks are listed in France, but also in the US or eventually at other stock exchanges, these laws of these countries definitely apply, and they give a certain very, very tight regulatory framework in the compliance field and anti-bribery field. Then you have UN recommendations, you have global international law and contracts that require to follow certain steps. And when you bring all those different rules that are out there together, you end up at a very, very tight possible way of doing business without being confronted with some kind of accusation. Might be bribery related, might be let's say compliance related. And in order to cover this and also again to demonstrate that this is important for everybody who is customer facing or who is facing let's say public administration at large, it is difficult enough, and so you need to bring that together to form a program to explain to everybody in the company what it means and why it is important for everybody personally, and train these people and really make them understand that it is not like it used to be maybe 25 years ago, that nobody cares who had dinner with whom or who had invited somebody to join them on their sailing ship or somewhere else. And so, of course, like you say, if this is happening and if something goes through the press and is discussed in public opinion, it doesn't only hurt the companies that are affected and that might have overlooked something in their internal way of let's say, training people or making people understand that this is not the right way of doing business. But it also hurts the larger market that is affected. And so with everything that happens and with everything that gets into the public domain, it gets more complicated and more complex for other companies to avoid the same thing from happening and to build up trust again, both by public administration, but also by customers. So that's definitely a problem. And it's also, when I say I've been training on these topics a lot and trying to make people understand, there is still a certain mindset out in many people that say, well, but of course, surely if I have a customer, I have to give them lunch, or I have to bring them to a nice little restaurant after we've concluded a contract, don't you think? And then you need to say, well, it is not as black and white as it was anymore. And you really need to look, who is the customer? Is he maybe representing a company that is publicly owned or partly publicly owned? And if so, there are certain guidelines in place up to a maximum amount, for instance, that you can spend and that you also have to report upon. For other items like whatever might be on the table for entertaining a person, or what is culturally relevant in a specific country, say there is this Formula One race, for instance, and it has been customary to go to the Formula One race with the customer for ages or so. And to change the mindset that these things, even if they were customary for ages, might not be normal anymore and might not be legal anymore is difficult. And so therefore you need to keep constantly raising the awareness of people and keeping them up to speed on the things that are happening there and that are regulated out there.
Okay.
I have another one. As far as I know, there are companies and people whose job is lobbying for other companies and so on. Does your company use their service, or do you have a maybe department just for that?
So no, there is a department, yes, and those people are mainly following up on what is happening, say, in Brussels or in Paris, for instance, for the mother company. And they also have a very tight reporting scheme back to the corporate level and the legal department there, and of course also work in a very tight frame. But of course there are lobbying firms out there, and smaller companies might use them. But also there, you might have followed up on these ideas of having lobbying registers, which is an interesting idea. I think that is happening since 10 years or so, never really flying, where EU institutions, for instance, say, we need you to be registered in this lobbying register and to tell us who you represent. Of course, if you work for a company, that's easier to say that obviously you represent your company. But if you're a lobbying firm, those lobbying firms are then requested to say, well, I work for company XYZ, and this is my annual turnover with these activities, so that people ideally, so that's the idea behind it, when they are approached by a lobbyist, can go to this registry and say, okay, this is Mr. So-and-so, and he is representing this company since so-and-so long, and he's earning that and that much with it. So that is a good idea, as with many things that are then drafted and compromised. It only works as well as it is, let's say, mandatory and sanctioned, and as well as people then want to use it.
Okay, now this is an interesting question which you mentioned, Slađan and Margit. Thank you for that. The fact that if you work with a company in one country and you are, for example, listed at a stock exchange in another one, then and you have your own domestic country, then you have to take into account every country you are in, or every association like European Union. For example, there was a very publicly known example of Deutsche Telekom and the criminal charges pressed by Security Exchange Commission in the United States in 2005-06 because of alleged bribing state officials of Montenegro and Macedonia through Magyar Telekom. So it's a famous case. You can find it on the internet, and it ended up in a way that Deutsche Telekom was fined by $95 million, something like that, which was 15 years ago. And then they delisted from the New York Stock Exchange to probably in some deal with the SEC to avoid further proceedings and so on. So these are a very risky situation. Whether they did or did not bribe anyone, I don't know. But the allegations were very severe, and it all ended up in a sort of deal between the company and the SEC. But this is not about lobbying anymore. This is a serious crime. Whether it happened or not, I'm not the judge here, of course. And the lobbying is perhaps it could take various shapes and various scopes, many scopes. It can happen on a very sort of petty level, you know. So taking out an official to a lunch, is it really bribing? Because nobody will privatize their national telecom operator to a foreign company for a lunch, you know. So if there is a bribe, it is much more serious than a lunch. But then what you were talking about is probably the corporate culture or national culture in the target country where you go to, because what is customary in for example in Croatia, it may not be customary in Finland or in United States or whatever. So when you work in an international environment, you have to take care of the diversity. So every country is basically different. And as I said, there are very many levels of where you can actually enter into lobbying or potential criminal. So, but then the borderline between the two is not that clear sometimes. So there's lots to learn about the thing if you want to be engaged in lobbying, and oftentimes you don't actually choose what you do when you, for example, take a job in a company. The company puts you to be their lobbyist, for example. I think, Margit, you did the most of your lobbying job for Siemens, actually, where you were in Siemens, right?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, in Brussels, yeah. And but tell me, please, how did we meet? We met in Croatia. Why was it? It was like 20 years ago. What happened?
Don't
So
make
you
me
were
look so
engaged.
old.
Yeah.
You're-
So you were engaged on some, I don't know what, cards project or what
Exactly.
was it? With Richard Harris? No, or was it even before?
Yeah, I think it was before, but he then came into the picture as well. Yeah, but for everybody's benefit. Yeah. So basically, this was something that I did during my lobbying job, basically, but I wouldn't consider it lobbying really. But it was a project that the EU financed at the time, and basically they said for all countries that want to join the European Union, they finance, let's say, trainings and lawmaking exercises in a specific arena. And the project I was involved in was in the ICT telecommunications field. And I think at the time it was to explain how the telecoms sector was evolving. So after being a monopoly for the longest time, the markets had to gradually open in the late 90s. And then the EU thought if all those countries that will want to join the Union at some stage will also have to get informed and familiarize themselves with the idea of having to face competition at a certain point in time in their telecoms markets. And so they then engaged an association in Brussels, so a trade association where lots of different companies, but also people from the European Commission were present to say, can't you look after this and form a delegation and go to various countries? I think from Lithuania, Latvia, and all those countries, Poland, Slovakia. We came also to Croatia at the time and said in various teams, always with a person specializing in radio spectrum policy topics, another person in institution building and building up new authorities for liberalized markets in, I think, first the telecom sector, later then in electricity as well, and in postal services. And with somebody from industry to say, how do we work with these legal changes and legal environment, and form little delegations and then go from country to country and speak to both the ministries that were still responsible for telecommunications, but also to the interested companies in those countries who might want to engage and become eventually an alternative telecoms network operator. And I think at the time then I was chosen for a couple of countries to work on these legal aspects, to say what has changed in the legal environments in the specific countries based on EU law, and how can you implement that both in the legal text, but also then informing a new authority for telecommunications. And in doing so, we then worked with people from the ministry and also interested people from certain companies. And there, in your role at the time, I think you were also interested in eventually becoming more engaged in the telecom sector, weren't you?
Yeah, that was the company which I worked for then, and I'm working still there. But then I was then in the regulatory authority. Did we meet because of that, or because there were some meetings with the state administration? I can't remember anymore because there were a lot of them. So, but it was interesting anyway. So this is for the audience. When you're working on international company, you sooner or later you deal with many various people, with a diverse group of the not only other companies but the state administration, which is especially in countries which reform the legislation of a certain industry sector, and these other companies from the abroad want to invest here and they want to study what goes on with the alignment of the local rules with the European, for example, and so on. So it's interesting. Any more questions from the audience? If not, then thank you, Margit, for sharing your time and your experience with us. And basically this is it. And I'm going to stop recording. The recording will be posted on the YouTube in a while, so I'll let you know. So